Timeless tales, a tale from European folklore, The Fisherman and His Wife. By the grey rim of the North Sea, where the land runs out and gives itself reluctantly to the water, there stood a fishing village so modest it had no name worth recording. The houses were low, the roads were mud, the boats were old, and the sea, which gave everything that the village survived on, gave it back in the way the sea always gives, without sentiment, without schedule, and with no promise that tomorrow would look anything like today. In the most modest dwelling at the edge of this village, not a cottage, not even quite a house, but a low building of dark timber that fishermen's families called a hovel, there lived a man named Johannes and his wife, Ilsebil. The hovel sat in a hollow where the damp never fully left. Its walls smelled of salt and of years. A single window looked out toward the water, and a single door opened onto a path of grey stone. Johannes was not an unhappy man. He rose before dawn, walked the path to his boat, set his nets, and pulled them in with the patience of someone who had made his peace with uncertainty. He did not expect much from the sea. He did not expect much from the world. And in that not expecting, he found a strange and quiet satisfaction that many richer men could never locate in themselves. This is worth saying clearly because the story is easy to misread. Johannes is not a small man. He is not timid or defeated. He is a man who has stood at the edge of an enormous, indifferent body of water every morning of his adult life, and in doing so has arrived slowly, without drama, at a kind of peace with his own scale. He knows what he is. He knows what the sea is. These two knowings, held together, make something in him steady. Ilsebil was different. Ilsebil was a woman of vivid imagination and powerful feeling, and what she felt more than anything else was that life had been meaner to her than it ought to have been. The hovel was too dark, too small, too damp. The pots were too few. The neighbors had more than they deserved. The wind through the single window was personal in its unkindness. She had not always been like this. But long winters and narrow walls have a way of narrowing a person, and Ilsebil, over the years, had grown precisely to the shape of everything she resented. One morning in early autumn, when the sea was the color of pewter and the sky above it barely lighter, Johannes rowed his boat out beyond the breakwater and cast his net. He sat in the stern, watching the water, thinking nothing in particular, which was how he preferred to spend his mornings. After a time the net grew heavy. He leaned over and drew it in, and at the center of the net, bright among the ordinary grey mackerel and silver herring, was a flounder, and not an ordinary flounder. It was large, where flounder were usually small. Its scales caught the flat autumn light and held it in a way that fish scales do not normally hold anything. Its eyes, as it hung in the net, were watching him with something that was not the blankness of a fish. Johannes was leaning forward to unhook it from the mesh when the flounder spoke. Not with a voice like a man's voice, not with a voice like anything he had heard before, but a voice nonetheless, low and resonant, and somehow under the sound of the sea rather than over it.
Please, fisherman, I am not what I appear. There is a prince caught inside this shape, placed here by an enchantment that I did not ask for and cannot break myself. I ask you to return me to the water, not as a favor that I will repay, not as a bargain, but simply as one living thing asking another for mercy. Put me back. There is nothing you need from me.
Johannes stared at the fish for a long moment. A talking fish was strange, yes, but a talking fish that asked for nothing in return, that was the strangest thing of all. He could have kept it. A flounder that size would have fed them both for 2 days and sold well at the morning market besides. But the flounder had asked him plainly, and it had asked for nothing in return, and Johannes was the kind of man who found that impossible to refuse. He opened the mesh and lowered his hands into the cold water, and the flounder slid from them and was gone, first a shimmer of scale below the surface, then nothing. The sea looked exactly as it had before. Johannes sat for a time in his empty boat, then rowed back to shore. That evening he told Ilsebil what had happened. He told it simply, with no dramatizing, the net, the flounder, the voice, the request, the release. He expected her to say that he had done the right thing, or perhaps to say nothing at all. She said neither of those things.
You let a magical fish go, a magical fish that could grant wishes, and you asked for nothing, Johannes, a magical fish. And you came home empty-handed from a net full of ordinary mackerel because you were too polite to ask a magical fish for a single thing. It didn't have to offer. You should have asked. You go back tomorrow. You find it. You tell it that your wife wants a decent cottage, not grand, not enormous, Just a real cottage with a proper roof and a fire that draws and enough rooms that we are not sleeping in the same air as the cooking. And you ask it please to provide one. Go. The flounder doesn't know what I need. Go.
Yes, it asked me to let it go. I let it go. It didn't offer anything. The flounder told me there was nothing I needed from it.
The next morning, Johannes went back to the sea. It looked different, the color of it. Not stormy, but restless, as though it were thinking about something. He stood at the water's edge and called out to the flounder, feeling a little foolish, calling into the sea as he had once called down the chimney as a boy. The flounder surfaced. He told it about Ilsebil. He told it about the cottage, the proper roof, the fire that draws, the rooms. He apologized for asking. He said his wife had sent him. The flounder listened, then it said, "Go home, fisherman, she has it." When he reached the hollow where the hovel had stood, there was instead a tidy cottage of whitewashed stone, a garden out front, a roof of good thatch. Inside, 2 rooms, bright, clean, warmed by a fire that drew perfectly. Ilsebil was standing in the kitchen with both hands resting on the table and a look on her face that Johannes had not seen in some years. She looked pleased. She looked, briefly, like herself again. For 3 days, the cottage was enough. On the 4th day, Ilsebil sent him back. The cottage was charming, she said, but it was still small. A stone mansion would be better, proper rooms, proper stairs, a proper garden with a wall around it. She was not being unreasonable. She simply knew now that more was possible. Johannes went back to the sea. It was the color of green glass now, or perhaps yellow-green, the color that the sea turns in the hours before a weather system arrives. He called the flounder. The flounder surfaced. He passed on the request about the stone mansion, apologizing again. The flounder said, "Go home, fisherman, she has it." The mansion was beautiful. Wide stone steps, a hall with a fireplace tall enough to walk into, a kitchen that could have served a restaurant, and upstairs with 4 bedrooms and windows that looked out over the water. Ilsebil walked through it twice in silence and stood at the window of the largest room for a long time. She was satisfied for perhaps a week. The first sign was a small one. The tradespeople who came to the door were polite, as they had always been, but they were not deferential. They called her ma'am, which is what anyone may be called, not my lady, not your ladyship. Ma'am, the word that implied she was a woman of some substance, perhaps, but not a woman of standing. The word turned in her chest for several days until she understood what it meant. The house had outgrown her rank. Or more precisely, her rank had failed to grow with the house, and the gap between them was like a window left open in winter. Small, but the only thing you could feel. She had a mansion, but she had no title to match it. There was nothing in the world, it seemed to her, that proclaimed she was the kind of person who should live in such a house. And a house without that proclamation was not, in the end, so very different from a cottage. She sent Johannes back to the sea. The sea was dark purple now, almost grey-black, the surface heaving in long, slow swells even though the air above it was still. Johannes stood at the edge of it and said the words that Ilsebil had given him, that she wanted to be queen. Of this country or any country, it did not matter which. A throne, a title, a court, ministers who listened when she spoke. She was not asking for much. She simply wanted her importance acknowledged by the world at the scale it deserved. The flounder surfaced from the dark water. Johannes could barely see it. He passed on the request, with less apology than before, because he had given up apologizing. "Go home, fisherman, she has it." The stone mansion had become a palace. Ilsebil sat on a throne in a great hall, attended by ministers and lords and ladies-in-waiting and a chamberlain who announced everyone who entered. The fireplace in her private chamber was the size of a room. The view from her tower was unobstructed to the horizon. The whole country, it was suddenly clear that there was a whole country, looked to her as its queen. Johannes was given a small room near the stables. He was comfortable there. He went fishing every morning because he was a fisherman, and because the palace was no more his than the hovel had been. For perhaps 2 weeks, Ilsebil was satisfied. In those 2 weeks she moved through the palace as though she had always inhabited it. She received delegations from distant provinces and signed documents at a desk of polished mahogany. She held audiences in the great hall where her voice carried easily to the rafters, and the ministers who stood before her chose their words with visible care, which she found, for the first time in her life, appropriate. She had the authority she had always believed she deserved, and it was good. It was genuinely good. She was not wrong to want it. The difficulty was in the small hours of the morning, when she stood alone at the eastern tower window and watched the sun clear the horizon on its own schedule, without consultation, without deference, as it had done on the morning she was born in the hovel and would do on every morning that followed, queen or not. The sun did not know she was queen. The tides did not know. The seasons had not adjusted. And bit by bit, the things that remained indifferent to her authority became the only things she could see. Then she decided that being queen was not enough. A queen is subject to the laws of the church. She should be pope. Johannes went back to the sea. The sea was black, not storm black, something quieter and more absolute than a storm. The water did not heave or crash. It sat still and vast and lightless, as if the sea had decided to stop performing and simply be what it was, old and patient and immeasurably deep. Johannes stood at the edge of it for a long time before he called out. The flounder took longer to surface than it had before. When it appeared, it rose slowly, and it looked, if a flounder can look anything, tired. He made his request. He had stopped apologizing. He had stopped feeling much about the requests at all. He was a messenger now. That was the job. Go home, fisherman, she has it. The palace had become the Vatican, or something like it. The largest church in the world, white and gold, towers visible from the sea. Ilsebil sat in the papal seat in robes of white and gold, surrounded by cardinals and bishops and priests and an architectural grandeur that silenced everyone who walked into it. She held the keys to heaven itself. Whole nations bowed their heads when she spoke. For 4 days, this was enough. Then Ilsebil looked out from her papal window at the sun, which was rising and setting every day without her permission, and at the moon, which did the same, and she felt, with the certainty she always felt at these moments, that this was wrong. She should command these things. She should be greater than the world she had been given. She sent Johannes back to the sea.
Tell the flounder, tell it plainly, that I want to be God, not like God, not alongside God. I want to command the sun and the moon, the tides and the seasons. I want the world to move when I say move and stop when I say stop. That is what I want. That is what I have always wanted. Go tell it.
Johannes walked down to the sea in the dark, because it was dark even though it should have been midday. The sky above the water was a wall of purple and black cloud, turning in a slow circle, as if the sky itself were becoming a drain. The sea beneath it had no color at all. It was simply water without light, cold, flat, moving without direction. He stood at the edge of it and called the flounder's name. The sea did not respond for a long time. Then the flounder rose, slowly, from a great depth, it seemed, and its scales caught no light at all in that darkness. Johannes told it what Ilsebil wanted. He said it plainly, without apology, without embellishment. He had learned over the course of all these trips that the plainness was the only thing he had left to offer. The flounder looked at him from the black water. Then it said, "Go home, fisherman." It did not say, "She has it." The storm hit the shore at the same moment Johannes turned to walk back up the path. Not a storm that builds and arrives, a storm that simply was, all at once, everywhere. The rain was horizontal. The wind came from no single direction. The path was gone and then it was back again, washed clean and grey and leading to the hollow where the hovel stood. The hovel, the low building of dark timber that smelled of salt and years. A single window, a single door, a fire struggling in the grate with no chimney worth the name. Ilsebil was sitting in her chair. She looked exactly as she had on the first morning, before the cottage, before the mansion, before the palace and the throne and the papal seat. She looked, if you did not know her well, like a woman who had never wanted anything but what she had. She looked, if you knew her better, like a woman who would begin again. And there they sat, and there, if the old fishermen of that coast are to be believed, there they are sitting still. The tale does not tell us what Johannes felt, sitting back in his hovel at the end of it all. It does not tell us whether he was angry or sad, or whether somewhere in the part of himself he rarely visited, he felt something disturbingly close to relief. The story is not really interested in Johannes. It never was. He is the messenger, the go-between, the one who walks the grey path between the world of wanting and the world of consequence. But there is something in him worth holding for a moment. He was a man who, when he first caught the flounder and heard it speak, asked for nothing. Not because he was passive, not because he lacked imagination or ambition, but because he had, in a long quiet life of mornings on the water, developed a sense of what enough felt like, and a sense, deeper than logic, that some things are not improved by being changed. His wife had the same capacity once. We are all born with it, but it requires tending, the way a fire requires tending. It must be fed carefully, with the right things, and not smothered by the larger and faster-burning fuel of comparison and discontent. The flounder granted every wish except the last. It was not cruel. It was not punishing. It was simply telling the truth that the sea has always known. There are requests that, if granted, would leave nothing of the person who made them. The boundary between what the flounder could give and what Ilsebil could hold was exactly the width of a human life. There is a version of this story, told quietly in the villages along that coast, in the way of things told quietly among people who know the sea, in which Johannes does not go back the last time, in which he stands at the door of the papal chamber and looks at his wife in her white and gold robes and simply says, "Enough, I will not go, this is enough." In that version, Ilsebil is furious, and then she is frightened. And then, after a long silence, something else, something that looks, from certain angles, very much like relief. The story does not require her to be a villain. It requires only that she never had anyone who loved her enough to say plainly, "The wanting will not stop on its own. It must be stopped. Enough is not a place the world will lead you to. It is a place you have to decide to stand." Johannes never said that. Perhaps he did not know how. Perhaps he knew and was afraid of what it would cost him. Or perhaps he was the kind of man who confused kindness with indulgence and spent his whole life walking a grey path he never questioned to a sea he was never done visiting. November 2022, an AI system called ChatGPT was made publicly available. Within 2 months, it had 100 million users, the fastest adoption of any consumer product in recorded history. People used it to write, to code, to plan, to reason. It answered questions that had taken hours of searching. It drafted emails, explained medical diagnoses, helped students understand calculus. For a brief season, it felt like a cottage appearing where a hovel had been. Like enough. Then GPT-4 arrived, and GPT-4 was astonishing. It passed bar exams. It scored in the 95th percentile on the graduate record examination. It could write code that ran, stories that moved people, arguments that held together. And within a few months of GPT-4, the conversation in boardrooms and laboratories had shifted entirely. When is GPT-5 coming, and what will it be able to do that GPT-4 cannot? This is the pattern. Every capability release impresses us, temporarily. Every model that can do what the previous model could not, reason through multi-step problems, generate images, browse the web, run code, satisfies us for a season, and then the season ends and we are already looking past it. We are always looking past it. The mechanism driving this is not greed in the simple sense. It is something more structural. Each new capability expands our sense of what is possible, and that expanded sense makes the current capability feel inadequate by comparison. The system is not failing us. We are failing ourselves. We are Ilsebil, standing at the sea with the next request already formed. And there is a request forming now, in the most ambitious corners of AI research and product development, that would make the flounder pause. It is the request for AI systems that do not just assist human judgment but replace it, that make decisions without oversight, that determine what we should want, that manage our choices, our attention, our relationships on our behalf. Not a cottage, not a palace, the sun and the moon. An AI that runs our lives so that we are freed from the burden of running them ourselves. The flounder, if it is listening, may have something to say about that. Because the wisdom in the old tale is not that wanting is wrong. The fisherman wanted to be kind to the fish. Ilsebil wanted a decent roof and a fire that draws. Those are not bad wants. The wisdom is that there is a size of want that cannot be satisfied by giving it what it asks for, because satisfying it only teaches it to ask for more. And the moment we ask a system to be our conscience, to be our will, to be the part of us that decides what kind of person we are, we have asked for something that cannot be given without dissolving the self that made the request.
Contentment is not the absence of desire, but the knowledge of when enough has been answered. The one who always wants more cannot be given enough, and in reaching past what is sufficient, loses even what was freely given. In the age of large language models, each wave of capability invites us to ask for more automation, more delegation, more relief from the effort of thinking. The boundary we must hold is not the boundary of what AI can give. It is the boundary of what we are willing to remain responsible for ourselves.
Thank you for spending this time with Timeless Tales. A new story awaits you tomorrow. Subscribe so you never miss one.